You probably think you know how bad the 1930s were, but history class completely skipped the part where the government essentially outlawed common sense. When the economy collapsed, politicians turned basic human survival into a federal crime. Today, we are tearing through 50 of the most absurd and outright dumb regulations citizens had to navigate during the Great Depression. 1. Because actual cash was incredibly scarce, rural communities survived by trading goods, like swapping fresh eggs for essential dental work. However, local tax authorities quickly realized they couldn't legally tax a live chicken. Many greedy municipalities passed bizarre ordinances attempting to heavily restrict or outright outlaw bartering, demanding all transactions be conducted in official currency. They were literally demanding cash from people who didn't possess a single coin, legally threatening desperate folks who were just trying to trade homegrown vegetables for winter firewood. 2. Buying dinner came with federal oversight. If you walked into a butcher shop in New York to buy a chicken, a strict government code completely outlawed you from picking the bird you wanted. You were legally required to accept whichever chicken the butcher handed you, even if it looked like it had lived a very hard life. This rule was established to prevent customers from leaving behind poor-quality chickens. The Supreme Court eventually had to step in and declare this bizarre poultry mandate unconstitutional. Bureaucracy literally reached right into your grocery basket. 3. Owning shiny rocks became a federal offense. Under the Gold Reserve Act of 1934, the government made it illegal for ordinary citizens to keep privately owned gold. If you had gold coins or bullion stashed under your mattress for a rainy day, you were legally obligated to surrender them to the Federal Reserve in exchange for paper money. Refusal meant a staggering $10,000 fine or 10 years in prison. Imagine the government knocking on your door today to confiscate your wedding ring. How quickly would you hand over your family heirlooms? 4. Getting married could legally destroy your career. Thanks to Section 213 of the Economy Act, the federal government mandated that if a married couple both worked for the government, one of them had to be fired immediately. Naturally, the unwritten rule was that the woman always lost her job. The idea was to free up employment for single men, but in reality, it just punished couples who were barely scraping by. They literally penalized people for being in a committed relationship. 5. Farm owners were so utterly terrified of starving laborers stealing tiny amounts of crops that they implemented deeply humiliating, legally binding dress codes. In some massive corporate orchards, hired hands were strictly mandated to wear custom-made, completely pocketless overalls. If a desperate worker tried to sew a hidden pouch into his pants just to smuggle a single bruised apple home to his starving children, he was fired and legally charged with attempted theft. The sheer paranoia of the wealthy dictated the literal fabric of the working class. 6. While families desperately needed every single penny just to afford a meager bowl of soup, cities decided to wage legal war on working children. Kids shining shoes or selling newspapers on street corners were suddenly targeted by heavily enforced municipal permit laws. Local governments demanded exorbitant licensing fees that a penniless shoeshine boy could never possibly afford. If a 10-year-old was caught polishing boots without an expensive government badge, police would confiscate his entire kit. The state literally stole from working children to balance their budgets. 7. Being poor was terrible, but looking poor on camera could actually get you into serious legal trouble. As famous photojournalists began traveling the country to document the harsh realities of the Depression, several paranoid municipalities passed bizarre local ordinances banning cameras entirely. Town councils were terrified that images of their starving citizens would ruin their precious civic reputations. They made it a criminal offense to photograph a soup line or a homeless encampment. Rather than feeding the hungry, politicians simply made it illegal to look at them. 8. Saving your own money could get you publicly shamed and investigated. Because the banks were collapsing, terrified citizens naturally started hiding their cash at home. The government decided to brand these frightened savers as unpatriotic hoarders. The president gave speeches ordering people to put their money back into the very banks that had just lost everything. There were even campaigns encouraging neighbors to report anyone suspected of hiding large amounts of cash under their floorboards. Would you have snitched on your neighbor for holding on to their savings? 9. Imagine waking up one morning to find out your bank account has been legally frozen by the president. During the 4-day National Bank holiday of 1933, every single bank in the country was ordered to lock its doors. You could not withdraw a single dime of your own hard-earned money to buy food or pay rent. People had to rely on bartering, using subway tokens, or writing "I owe us" just to buy groceries. The government simply locked up everyone's life savings without warning and expected people to just figure out how to survive the week. 10. Being broke was practically a municipal crime. When families lost their homes and were forced to build makeshift shacks in shanty towns known as Hooversvilles, local governments responded with cruel vagrancy laws. Instead of offering help, police were ordered to regularly raid these encampments and burn the cardboard and tin shelters to the ground. You were legally required to vacate public land, even though there was absolutely nowhere else for you to go. They literally criminalized poverty, punishing people for a disaster created by Wall Street. 11. When the banks completely collapsed, nobody could afford gasoline, prompting a massive surge in adults riding bicycles just to search for work. City politicians saw this desperate shift not as a survival tactic, but as a brilliant revenue stream. Suddenly, archaic laws were dusted off, requiring highly expensive, mandatory metal license plates and annual taxes for pedal bikes. If a jobless man could not pay the municipal bicycle tax, the police legally impounded his only physical means of finding employment across town. 12. Local school boards enforced incredibly rigid, highly discriminatory lifestyle clauses specifically targeting female teachers. It wasn't just the federal government firing married women. Local districts completely barred educators from getting married, dating, or even being seen at a local ice cream parlor with a man. They were also legally forbidden from wearing bright colors or dyeing their hair. If you wanted the privilege of teaching basic math during the Depression, you effectively had to take a strict vow of total, joyless monasticism. Your private life was municipal property. 13. If you were a destitute farmer fleeing the devastated Dust Bowl for the sunny promise of California, you hit a literal wall of badges. The LAPD illegally stationed armed officers at the state border, hundreds of miles away from Los Angeles, enforcing a completely unconstitutional action known as the bum blockade. They aggressively demanded incoming families prove they had exactly $50 in cash. If your pockets were empty, they turned you away or arrested you on the spot. California essentially tried to secede from poverty by building an invisible wall. 14. The National Recovery Administration didn't just target small tailors and butchers. They came directly for the local bakers. Federal bureaucracy strictly mandated exactly how much a standard loaf of bread should weigh, and the precise, inflexible price it had to be sold for. If a charitable baker accidentally made a loaf slightly too large, giving a starving family a few extra calories for their dime, they were fiercely violating federal law. Bureaucrats literally criminalized generosity. Would you risk a hefty government fine just to feed a hungry family a little bit more? 15. Public libraries became the only heated sanctuaries for millions of freezing, unemployed citizens. In response, heartless municipal governments quickly enacted insanely strict anti-loitering reading laws. You were legally forbidden from sitting in a library chair purely to stay warm. If a librarian caught you staring blankly without aggressively reading a book, or God forbid, closing your eyes for 5 seconds, you were immediately, legally evicted back into the snow. They essentially weaponized classic literature to brutally gatekeep basic indoor heating. 16. Broadcasters were absolutely terrified of making a depressed nation even sadder, leading to unwritten but strictly enforced network rules against playing melancholic music on the radio. Catchy, aggressively upbeat tunes were heavily mandated by station managers. If a new song mentioned poverty, soup lines, or general despair, they ripped it right off the turntables. The media elites honestly believed they could cure a devastating economic collapse by simply forcing everyone to listen to cheerful jazz. Would forced artificial positivity actually fix your empty bank account today? 17. Jumping out of a Wall Street window became the dark, tragic cliché of the 1929 stock market crash. But here is the truly sinister legal twist. Attempting to end your own life was still heavily categorized as a severe criminal offense. If your bank failed, your home was repossessed, and you miraculously survived a plunge off a city bridge, the police were legally waiting on the riverbank to arrest you. The state practically demanded you endure the economic hellscape they created, aggressively punishing absolute despair with prison time. 18. To survive the brutal economic collapse, multiple generations of families or groups of friends naturally started piling into single-family homes to split the meager rent. Local zoning inspectors responded with absolute, cold-blooded legal fury. They strictly enforced archaic residential laws, completely outlawing more than one family living under a single roof in specific neighborhoods. If a landlord was caught letting two struggling families share a living room, he was heavily fined. The law actively preferred people freezing in the streets over slightly overcrowded residential houses. 19. Imagine losing your entire national identity just for falling in love. Up until the mid-1930s, lingering elements of the Expatriation Act meant that if an American woman married an immigrant man, she was legally stripped of her United States citizenship. She instantly became an undocumented alien in her own country. During a time when finding a job or getting federal relief required strict proof of citizenship, the government basically told women they had to choose between a husband and basic constitutional rights. 20. When devastated families lost their homes, their last remaining asset was often a beat-up Ford Model T, which quickly became their makeshift metal house. Naturally, brutal local police departments heavily enforced strict anti-camping ordinances, making it entirely illegal to sleep inside your own legally parked vehicle. Officers would actively patrol the dark streets, loudly waking up terrified families and severely ticketing them for illegal lodging. Do you really think it is perfectly fair to legally punish someone when their rusty car is their absolute last refuge? 21. Thousands of desperate, starving artists were hired by the government to paint large murals inside post offices and federal buildings. Yet their contracts came with ironclad artistic censorship. They were legally forbidden from painting the actual grim reality of the Depression happening right outside the door. Artists were forced to depict robust, wildly muscular farmers and joyful, thriving factory workers. The state essentially utilized taxpayer money to mandate an artificial painted utopia while the actual citizens stood in breadlines. 22. Sundays during the Depression were a bizarre legal minefield due to archaic, heavily enforced blue laws. In many states, it was completely illegal to buy anything considered a non-essential good on a Sunday. You could legally buy a morning newspaper or a loaf of bread. But if a desperate hardware store owner tried to sell you a hammer or a tin of paint to fix your leaking roof, he could be arrested and shut down. The struggling economy was completely frozen for 24 hours every single week purely in the name of outdated morality and preserving the Sunday Sabbath. 23. When the bank inevitably foreclosed on your family home, the legal eviction process in some major cities was brutally, terrifyingly efficient. Sheriffs were strictly bound by local protocols that sometimes gave families exactly 3 minutes to gather their entire lives before the doors were officially padlocked. If you could not physically carry your mother's antique clock or your winter coats out to the curb in 180 seconds, they instantly became the property of the bank. Imagine losing absolutely everything you own just because you couldn't pack boxes fast enough. 24. If you lived near a rural lake and just wanted to catch a free dinner to survive, you had to navigate incredibly brutal, newly enforced municipal fishing licenses. Even if you were entirely penniless, catching a single tiny trout without an expensive, government-issued piece of paper made you a notorious, illegal poacher. Game wardens aggressively confiscated fishing poles from starving fathers just trying to feed their crying kids. 25. Trying to trade in a used car was heavily regulated by federal laws designed to prevent price gouging, but it completely backfired on consumers. The government mandated a strict price book dictating exactly how much a dealership could give you, regardless of the vehicle's actual condition. If you had a pristine Ford and your neighbor had a rusted, non-running bucket of the exact same model, the law forced the dealer to offer you both the same terrible price. Bureaucracy completely erased the concept of maintaining your property, punishing people who actually took care of their things. 26. If you were lucky enough to receive government relief, social workers were legally empowered to ruthlessly police your private life. Families receiving aid had to follow extremely strict budgeting rules dictated by state auditors. If an inspector discovered you spent a few extra pennies of your relief money on a cheap movie ticket or a pack of cigarettes instead of cabbage, your entire family could be instantly cut off from all federal aid. Do you honestly believe the government should have the absolute authority to dictate exactly how you spend every single penny of your meager income? 27. Real federal currency practically vanished during the crash. Desperate towns started minting their own emergency money out of clamshells, wood, and even leather scraps. Instead of offering genuine help, angry federal regulators frequently threatened local mayors with severe counterfeiting charges just for using these wooden nickels to pay municipal workers. Bureaucrats actually expected starving communities to just patiently starve while waiting for real dollar bills, aggressively outlawing the only functioning local economies of the era. 28. In 1934, a hardworking immigrant tailor named Jacob Majed was thrown into jail for the unforgivable crime of pressing a suit. His sinister misdeed wasn't stealing the suit or burning it. Under the new National Recovery Administration rules, the government mandated that pressing a suit must cost exactly 40 cents. Jacob charged 35. For offering a 5-cent discount during the worst economic crisis in history, he spent 3 days behind bars. Makes you wonder, would you risk federal prison just to give your neighbor a tiny break on dry cleaning? 29. The absolute chaos of the agricultural markets led to a bizarre, highly specific rule regarding vegetables. Farmers were so terrified of intense price manipulation by Wall Street speculators that a movement began to completely ban the trading of onion futures. You could legally trade futures contracts on corn, wheat, or crude oil. But gambling on the future price of an onion eventually became a highly illegal federal offense. The government looked at the collapsing stock market and decided the real, impending danger to American society was the speculative pricing of root vegetables. 30. With absolutely no money for train tickets and cars rapidly repossessed by banks, hitchhiking became the only realistic way to travel while looking for work. Naturally, many fearful states made it an outright crime. Standing on the shoulder of a dusty highway with your thumb out could quickly land you in the county jail for vagrancy. The government effectively trapped unemployed, desperate citizens in completely dead factory towns, legally forbidding them from catching a free ride to places where jobs actually existed. They successfully made it a literal crime to look for a better life. 31. Going to the movies was the ultimate depression escape, but authorities allowed moral zealots to totally hijack the script. Under the strictly enforced Hays Code of 1934, Hollywood directors were bound by hilariously prudish mandates. An on-screen kiss could legally not last longer than 3 measly seconds. Even weirder, married couples were strictly required to sleep in separate twin beds, and if an actor sat on a mattress, one foot had to remain firmly planted on the floor at all times. They essentially outlawed basic human intimacy while the economy was actively burning. 32. Ladies, imagine getting thrown into the back of a police cruiser just for wearing comfortable trousers. In the 1930s, many American cities fiercely enforced archaic laws that made it a literal crime for women to wear pants in public. Police officers actively cited women in slacks under the absurd charge of masquerading as a man. You could be starving, desperately searching for a job, and still get slapped with a devastating court fine purely because your outfit didn't include a legally mandated skirt. Does your everyday wardrobe make you a municipal criminal? 33. When Prohibition finally ended, states were totally terrified of people actually having fun, so they passed profoundly idiotic consumption rules. In places like Texas and New York, It was strictly illegal to consume a newly legalized beer while standing up. You had to remain firmly seated at a table to take a sip. If you stood up to wave at a friend or walk to the bathroom with your glass, a bartender was legally obligated to confiscate your drink. Politicians honestly believed that vertical drinking was the absolute gateway to total societal collapse. 34. The Works Progress Administration hired millions of desperate men to build roads, but it also birthed the most ridiculous workplace micromanagement in history. Because political opponents accused WPA workers of being incredibly lazy, strict guidelines were implemented regarding how men could physically hold their tools. Foremen actually wrote up workers for the high crime of leaning on a shovel for too many seconds between hauling dirt. Imagine doing backbreaking manual labor for pennies, only to face disciplinary action because your resting posture violated federal protocol. 35. We know school boards were terrifyingly strict, but they also engaged in literal economic hostage-taking. Local districts aggressively mandated that teachers could not legally leave the town limits over the weekend. Their employment contracts explicitly bound them to spend every single penny of their meager salaries at local town merchants to artificially stimulate the microscopic local economy. If a teacher caught a train to a neighboring county just to buy cheaper groceries, she was immediately fired for municipal treason. 36. While the corporate dairy lobby was legally forcing farmers to violently dump millions of gallons of fresh milk into the rivers to artificially inflate prices, they simultaneously pushed through ruthless city ordinances. It became entirely illegal for a starving family to walk directly to a local farm and purchase a cheap jug of raw milk. You were legally mandated to buy the heavily marked up, commercially pasteurized milk exclusively from a grocery store. Bureaucracy literally forced the poor to blindly fund the dairy monopolies. 37. If you thought the government stealing your gold was bad, just wait until they came for your fancy spoons. Following the Gold Reserve Act, Congress doubled down with the Silver Purchase Act of 1934. The president legally nationalized all private silver, forcing citizens to hand over their bullion to the treasury at a brutally dictated price. Failure to surrender your private property resulted in a massive penalty tax. How would you react if the IRS demanded you hand over your grandmother's silver dining set to magically fix a collapsed national economy? 38. When struggling, unemployed families couldn't afford their landlords, they invented the iconic rent party, charging a tiny cover for live jazz and cheap bathtub gin. Instead of celebrating this brilliant survival tactic, the police aggressively classified these small apartment gatherings as entirely illegal, unlicensed cabarets. They violently raided private homes and arrested hosts for the horrific crime of throwing a fun party just to avoid eviction. 39. Many New England towns dusted off incredibly cruel, centuries-old colonial laws known as warning out statutes to deal with the influx of jobless migrants. If you moved into a new town looking for work, the local sheriff could legally serve you with an official paper declaring that you would never, ever be eligible for local charity or town support. Even worse, this legal document gave authorities the right to physically escort you back to the town border. They legally weaponized the concept of neighborly hospitality to aggressively kick starving people back onto the highway. 40. You simply cannot grasp the sheer lunacy of the era until you read the federal code regulating women's underwear. The National Recovery Administration actually spent taxpayer money drafting a violently strict, incredibly detailed rulebook for the corset and brassiere industry. They mandated exactly how much elastic could be legally used in a single garment and dictated the precise hours a factory seamstress could stitch a bra. It is both hilarious and deeply tragic that fixing the American economy apparently required a profound federal investigation into the structural integrity of lingerie. 41. When starvation hit the city limits, desperate families naturally started raising chickens and pigs in their tiny urban backyards just to survive. Naturally, out-of-touch city councils rushed to pass extremely strict zoning ordinances, making it entirely illegal to own livestock within the city borders. Health inspectors acted like municipal SWAT teams, raiding neighborhood vegetable gardens to violently confiscate unapproved dairy goats. They legally prioritized maintaining perfectly manicured lawns. Would you break a local zoning law to ensure your family had fresh eggs during a massive economic collapse? 42. Believe it or not, the National Recovery Administration wrote a strictly enforced legal code specifically regulating the dog food industry. Bureaucrats aggressively monitored the exact ratio of meat to cheap filler. While ordinary citizens waited in massive, desperate breadlines, highly paid federal agents were basically taste-testing kibble compliance. 43. California's sheer hatred for poor migrants reached an absolute fever pitch with the passing of the deeply sinister Anti-Okie law. It became a highly punishable, heavily fined misdemeanor to bring an indigent person into the state, even if that desperately poor person was your own immediate family member. If a brother drove his starving sister across the state line to offer her a warm place to sleep, he was legally treated like a violent human smuggler and thrown in a county jail. The state weaponized the legal system to utterly destroy family loyalty, forcing people to choose between abandoning their relatives in the harsh Dust Bowl or becoming literal convicts. It took a massive Supreme Court ruling years later to finally destroy this insanely cruel mandate. 44. If your family was lucky enough to live in government-subsidized housing or receive federal relief, you completely forfeited your basic right to home improvement. Strict mandates explicitly outlawed poor tenants from painting their fading walls or making minor vital repairs without official, written bureaucratic approval. If a father simply tried to fix a drafty winter window with scrap wood to keep his kids warm, he risked immediate legal eviction for unauthorized property alteration. The government essentially demanded that the poor remain perfectly, aesthetically miserable. 45. The federal pretzel code was remarkably unhinged. Bureaucrats actually attempted to standardize the exact size and geometric twist of a commercial pretzel, threatening massive financial penalties for bakeries that sold unusually shaped rogue snacks. They literally criminalized dough geometry during a historic financial meltdown. 46. During the darkest financial years, movie theaters desperately tried to lure in broke audiences by hosting dish nights, handing out free, cheap porcelain plates with every ticket. It was a massive success, allowing destitute women to slowly collect a full set of dinnerware. But federal regulators abruptly stepped in and outlawed the practice entirely. They classified handing out a free soup bowl as a malicious, unfair trade practice. The government literally preferred empty theaters over letting poor families score a free piece of china. 47. Being a waitress in a cheap Depression-era diner was already grueling, but the legal framework made it significantly worse. In several states, strict wage laws legally allowed restaurant owners to entirely confiscate a server's hard-earned tips to magically offset their abysmal minimum wage requirements. You could smile, hustle all day on your feet, and earn a few silver dimes from generous customers, only to watch your greedy boss legally pocket every single cent. The law effectively sanctioned blatant wage theft against the most vulnerable working women in the country. 48. When local charities completely ran out of money, heroic citizens started organizing rogue, neighborhood soup kitchens out of their own residential garages. Incredibly, many city health departments completely outlawed them. They demanded these grassroots charity operations pass impossible, wildly expensive restaurant-grade health inspections. If your kind neighbor tried to hand out a bowl of homemade stew without a municipal catering license, police could forcefully shut the entire operation down. They literally made it a massive health code violation to save your own street from starvation. 49. Before you could receive a single crumb of government relief, many states legally forced you to sign a deeply humiliating document known as the Pauper's Oath. But signing away your dignity was not enough. In some cruel jurisdictions, the law mandated that your name be published in the local newspaper's destitute list for all your neighbors to scrutinize. Would you gladly let the local government publicly brand you as a penniless failure in print just to secure a small bag of flour for your family? Okay, we have covered 49 points, and there is only one final rule left. But before we get to number 50, it is time for the final verdict. In our opinion, The award for the absolute dumbest rule from today's list goes to the federal code strictly regulating the geometry of commercial pretzels. Simply because prosecuting bakers for twisted dough during a global financial meltdown is the absolute peak of bureaucratic madness. Do you agree with our verdict? Or did another insane regulation earn that dubious honor? Let us know in the comments. And now, our final entry. 50. In a desperate, wildly unethical bid to stop massive bank runs, several states actually passed laws making it a severe criminal offense to spread derogatory rumors about the financial health of a bank. If you truthfully warned your neighbor that the local savings and loan was completely out of cash, you could be thrown in federal prison for inciting a public panic. The government legally forced citizens to smile and lie while their entire financial worlds burned to the ground. The Great Depression proves that when society collapses, bureaucracy only tightens its absurd grip. Knowing that politicians actively chose corporate profits over starving citizens, do you think our current government would act any differently during a total collapse? Let us know down in the comments. Hit that like button, subscribe for more unbelievable historical absurdities, and always remember to question the rules.